Our next plenary session, of course, is changing neighbourhoods and urban spaces for Whānau Māori. What do we already know and how do we work with housing developers? Kei aku iti, kei aku rai. To my right here, Dr. Ella Henry. Next to her, I had to turn around and make sure you hadn't changed seating. Otherwise, I'd have said the handsome Tamati Patuwai and Anna had moved there. Roe, of course, down the end, and Helen Potter next to him. Ladies and gentlemen, please show some love.
Ngā mihi nunui ki a koutou katoa, ki ngā tāngata whenua e konei, kia ora, and tēnā koutou katoa. One of these things works. So we looked at all those really flash pictures this morning. I think I might be one of those Māori researchers that sits around in my office and writes a lot of words, because you're going to get a shitload of words out of me. So, I'm part of a group that is actually not one of the Kaingatahi Kaingarua researchers. We're part of the urban, there's an urban strategic research area focus within the building challenge, and we've been one of 4 groups looking at different aspects of urban regeneration, urban development, and in the case of Christchurch, urban rebuild. And my little group of researchers, many of whom are here today, and I'll hopefully get a chance to introduce them, we're tasked with 4 specific research questions, and I'm going to work on the assumption that you can all read, so I'm not going to read it out to you. But basically, for the last 4 years, since the middle of 2015, I've been bringing the team together, and we've been focusing on Glen Innes, because Glen Innes is a really interesting suburb that has been around for about 50, 60 years, and certainly when you meet Tamati, you'll find out a little bit more. But it's been home to a significant number of Māori and Pacific Island whānau for generations, and most of them lived in social housing corporation. And then, starting about 6 years ago, the plan was to replace that ageing housing stock on quarter-acre blocks with new, semi-detached houses. So 2,700 houses would be taken down and 7,500 would replace it. And so everybody who was in the social housing would go back into it. But we really did not know much about what kind of impacts that was going to have, because that is a strategy that's going to be rolled out in more suburbs around the country. We know already Mangere in Auckland and Onehunga and maybe other parts of Christchurch and Wellington. So we wanted to capture the experiences of whānau living in those communities, and also ask questions around things like the importance of te Aotearoa, and I'm going to assume this is a design conference that you all are familiar with the Te Aotearoa Māori design principles. Also looking at how Māori experience and live in that place, and also what kind of stakeholder groups were being formed. So that was basically the agenda. Now, we're a group of researchers, some of whom you've already met today, the fabulous Jackie Paul, and of course we've referred to the work of Diane Menzies. So we're a kind of multi-disciplinary group, and we're from multiple institutions. There's primarily designers. I'm the token Māori development person, which is why I write everything instead of doing pretty pictures. And we are all Māori researchers, and though this research is not part of the Kaingatahi Kaingarua suite of research, we're all committed to doing it in a very kaupapa Māori research way. So that's shaped and informed the ontology and epistemology of the research, as well as the way that work has rolled out over the last 3 years. And I guess it's at this point I'd like to acknowledge that Building Challenge has been a really interesting experience for me to be part of. After being involved for 25 years in research projects, this is the first time I've actually been involved with a research project where a Māori perspective and Mātauranga Māori has been evident at every level, from governance to senior executive management to science leadership, right down to the highest percentage of Māori researchers of any of the national science challenges. And that is a credit to the governance group, and it's a credit to the amount of forethought that went in, and Jess is certainly taking that whakaaro forwards with the Kaingatahi Kaingarua suite of research projects. So that's been really an exciting part about this project. So we went out, we did stuff, we hung out with people, we interviewed people, we had wānanga, because I come from a time when wānanga was a verb and not a noun. So that means, hanging out and chewing the fat and chilling and sharing a bit of kai and generally getting to be in the community, but also in a kind of critical research way. So what do we find out? So going back to those questions, the research questions, in terms of the perceptions of place, this was actually matched by the research being conducted by the Tāmaki Regeneration Company. The community has changed, the demographics. So where you had a predominantly Māori Pacific Island and other immigrant groups there now, it's a much more diverse, i.e. there's more white people living there now because they can afford the $1 million price on the new houses. Yay! Woo! So that has meant for many of the local community, the ones who've been able to return, a lot of their old community facilities and resources are gone. And whereas before, actually, one of the people I spoke to said she grew up in the area and there were no fences. There was like a chicken wire thing to keep the dogs in, That was it. And now there are these 6-foot fences between all these properties. So it's not like neighbours looking over neighbours. So that's a kind of change, a fundamental change. We did find evidence, and this is work certainly that Jackie and Karen Wilson have been doing around how the Te Aranga design principles are important and actually have been used to some extent in terms of the way the Tāmaki Regeneration Company has developed and designed some aspects, but Tāmati might have a different view because of his experiences with a couple of experiences around using a totally inappropriate Māori word for the name of a street. We don't think about it until, who's checked that kupu is appropriate for this iwi, for this rohe, or that it's an appropriate word? So there's still work to be done, but it's an interesting area where they are at least trying to incorporate Te Aranga designers, co-design as well. And of course, we've been lucky because having Lucy Tukua in our team, who is actually mana whenua for Tāmaki Glen Innes, has meant she's given us that unique mana whenua perspective, which I would challenge every research team, whatever your area or discipline, if you're going to be doing research around design and whenua and community, try and make sure you have somebody from mana whenua in your research team and not just, she's Maori, so it's all right. Not that I'm complaining. But it is an important part of a research project, I believe, especially at the high levels that we're operating at. And also some of the findings that I thought were interesting is we've seen with our research with the Tāmaki Regeneration Company that they are an interesting example of Housing New Zealand and Auckland Council working in a collaboration and at the governance level having community representation as well. And whilst I think there are weaknesses in that model, I'm concerned that some of the other models are really single agency rather than multiple agency and stakeholder at the levels of governance. So I don't know that you get the same amount of community and stakeholder participation. But anyway, they have developed a longitudinal strategy. So they've conducted research in the years before the demolition and then the years afterwards, and then developed a range of services. So there is an element in those models that I think is useful when we look at the other regeneration projects that are going to be rolled out around the country. We also talked to a number of developers, and certainly they mirrored the same kinds of things that are being reflected in the media around, the problems that are slowing down the urban builds in this country are actually a very similar set of issues. The complexity of the consent processes, the fact that different councils have different consent processes. I interviewed one of the people in Tāmaki who had a contracted to build 190 houses, and he showed me the photograph of the 3-ton truck that they had put all of the paperwork for 190 consents on. It was like half of the back of a large truck that all of the paperwork required for the consents for 190 buildings. That's crazy. Why more of it isn't online? So that's kind of an interesting area. And of course, the costs of land, infrastructure, building materials and labour, which really have exacerbated the costs of building in Auckland, certainly, and I think in other places. And, it's all very well and good saying we're going to address homelessness, but we've still got to build houses at ridiculous prices. And unless we can start addressing that, I think we've got some real issues. Many community organisations remain concerned because there have been a lot of stresses on those families who've had to move out, come back in, wait. They've been living in construction sites for years. So here are some strategies that we're starting to develop. And if anybody's interested, we've got some working papers from the research we've done. Certainly the work that Diane Menzies has been leading around the importance of social procurement, which is a fancy word for just a phrase for talking about how you're going to buy local. You know, and I say this at a time when most New Zealand councils in this country do not buy local. You know, it's like American companies that take our rubbish away and Canadian companies that deal with funders. I mean, it's a mindset, but if we can't develop social procurement strategies like that, we have some other issues. Other strategies around design charrettes, which I think is a fancy word for wānanga. But, you know, it's kind of classy phrase. So it's about community initiating the discourse and social cohesion. That is the real thing that I think is critically important as strategies that help build and maintain social coherence. And so what we've found is that community social cohesion strategies in Glen Innes actually exist. There are an amazing group of community organisations. One of them is called Pātaka Kai, initiated in Glen Innes by Danny Bergen of Island Child, and local whānau just build a little pātaka in their front and then put food out for rough sleepers and for people having trouble financially so they don't have to beg. They could just go and, you know, share food. And so that is a really amazing thing. Mad Ave Community Trust is also an organisation at the forefront of community development in the area. And over the last 2 years, they've created a strategy called Home Fires. And so I'm really pleased at this point to be able to introduce Tamati Patuai, because he and his wife are Mad Ave Community Trust, and as far as we're concerned in terms of our research, are really innovative at developing strategies that bring communities together, not just Māori communities, but communities. So I'm really pleased to be able to introduce you. Boom, boom. And I think I'm on time.
Ki roa I te tipua, kia rua I te tawhito. Kia u, kia tina, kia whena. Hara mai te toki. Haumi e hui e, tā iki e. Patua te pau, tuki a te pau. Whakarahi a ngā pekerangi, ngā tukupu, ngā tuku waru o tēnei pā. Kia wia wini, kia wia wana. Hara mai te haukino, te hauruna, te haukaitaua, he toka tūmoana. Hara mai te toki, haumi e hui e, tā iki e. Mihi ake ki tō tātou taumata o te ao, tēnā koe e pā. Huri noa kia rātou ngā tau kua wehe, tangi atu kia koutou, haere. Hoi no, kia tātou hunga ora, tēnā tātou katoa. Tēnā koutou kui mā karama, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora tātou. Ko tāmati ahau, Ngāti whātua te iwi, te tau u, kaura wāmaki, Ngāti Scottish, Ngāti Irish, e rātua ngā iwi, te Celtic. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you so much, Ella. And it's a privilege to be up here with my cousin, Anahira, with Rau and the whānau up here. Thank you so much for having me. How do we work together? How are we willing to be in this space together? What are we willing to commit to when we are together? A lot of the story that Ella has presented, and I just saw John Reed's kōrero before, touches my heart and touches the space of my heart of grief. I'm born and bred in the hood, GI. Mad Ave is the name of our organisation. And the disaster that John Reed talks about is my people. It's my place, my home. A disaster. Anyone that knows, does anyone know Mad Ave here? Mad Ave, it has a reputation. For many, think it's a disastrous reputation. For those of us that grew up around there, it's our home. Strength, resilience, sensitivity, worth, value, depth, breadth, mana, love, generosity. It's home. It's our people. How are we willing to work with that? The disaster that we know, who are we willing to be in the face of that? So my wife and I, my family and I, and much of our whanaunga here have joined up to create some collaborative ways of working. Mērev is our crew. Just grab my button over here. And this is one example of our work. Te Pauorongo, Mount Roskill Puketapapa local board invited me to come and have a look at some collaborative action to work the diversity of that 120 rich ethnicity community together. So I had some bright ideas with some cousins from Orake, and we decided to create a whakairo wānanga where Indian, Muslim, Chinese, rangatahi, elderly could come together to learn about mana whenua, learn about iwi, learn about each other, learn about their place, carving this po. And this was the last day, naming and blessing ceremony that we had. And it was a beautiful, beautiful moment for me personally and for that group there. That's the core group. So in a nutshell, that's the kind of mahi we do at Mērev. This is my whānau, Fenchurch Street. Anyone know Fenchurch Street? Yeah, Fenchurch. I'm on Fenchurch, and this is the front yard I've been on all my life, 45 years. I've been on that front yard. My parents bought the house in the 80s, so very fortunate for me. These are all my children and my sister, next to the dog that's just about to jump onto his bigger brother. Over there, that's what we've been surrounded by for the last 5 years. Heavy, heavy development. And as far as I understand, some of the most significant and biggest property development projects in New Zealand. And that's my whānau. That's where we live. That's the hood. That's Fenchurch. We're having fun, playing games. Peter Sonjay talked about two types of change. Explicit change, which is policy-driven, which is structural, management, human resource, money resource, power sharing, power development. He also talked about implicit change from the inside, our mental models, who we are, how we be, and in a nutshell, the two binaries of power and love. Martin Luther King said that love without power is sentimental and anemic. It's ungrounded. Power without love is reckless and abusive. And we heard that from John Reed. We're in a disaster. This is from the Home Fires project that the second Home Fires project that we finished 3 weeks ago. This was a pōhiri workshop that we presented to community. We invited them to come and learn about Māori ways of working and the Māori protocol of encounter called pōhiri. We unpacked it for about 4 hours. That photo is awesome because what is the main take? Is it tikanga mo tikanga ake? Kawa mo kawa ake? He hanga hua o ēnei mea? What are the fruits of this work? And that beautiful little boy in the middle is that. So the Home Fires is a collaboration of cultural experts, creative experts, community development experts. We create opportunities for local neighbourhood, local people, community, people from the hood, to come and share their stories. Most of it at the moment is grief. We're grieving. The change is wicked. It's rushed, it's tough, it's deep. Our hearts have broken. They're breaking. So we provide an opportunity in the way that we know how, tikanga. Ki raro i te parira o tō tātou atua, manaki, to provide for that tangi, provide for that space. And from there, we believe we can then create vision. We can create from a clearing called aroha, real engagement, real listening. We come out with some cool stuff. At the end of our 2019 Home Fires, we created a pōhiri, the full-blown pōhiri, with the wero, the young fella at the front, all the karanga, all the whaikōrero, all the tikanga, to invite and call the new neighbourhood, the new neighbours that have moved into Fenchurch Street, to be settled. And we wanted to be with them, to say, it's been rough. All of these young Pākehā people, sort of in their late 20s, early 30s, no babies yet, first mortgage. These Middle Eastern people, no babies yet, first mortgage. Koreans, Filipinos, Middle Eastern people, in the hood, first time, we wanted to tell them straight up, it's been hard. And we're in this place together. We're in this neighbourhood together now. As far as we understand your family, welcome, welcome, welcome. How can we do this together? And they were like, oh, far out. This photo up here in the top right corner was one of the coolest moments. All of them are Filipino. None of them knew each other, and they were in the same street. When they were at the pōhiri, they went, are you Filipino? I was like, yes, yes, yes. They found each other, and they had a really good time at the pōhiri. We all had a great time, Muslim, Pākehā, Filipino, all of the different ethnicities that now live in what was a highly Māori Pacific Island and some Pākehā neighbourhood. Who are we? Who are we willing to be? In the face of disaster, do we need it to get worse? To be available, to be respectful, to make real transformation that will change all of those statistics to beautiful, beautiful futures for our whānau. Hoi no, tēnā koutou, kia ora tātou katoa.
Tēnā tātou katoa, Ngāti Toaranga tira te Aotearoa, tēnei te mihi kia koutou katoa, I whakakangia te ahi ki roto i te whanganui ātara, tēnei te mihi. Ko maunga kia te maunga, ko ai te mata te moana, ko mahuhu ki te rangi te waka, ko Ngāti Whātua te iwi, ko te tau te urengutu, ko ngā oho, ngā hapu, ko rākei, ko rewiti, ngā marae. Ko anahira rāuri tōku ingoa, ngā mihi kia koutou katoa. Kia ora everyone. Thank you for having us here today. I'd like to acknowledge our team before I start. That would be Ro, over there, Ro Hoskins, Irene Kiriama Royal, who couldn't be here today, and also May Hill, who we've worked on this kaupapa around vertical papakainga and what that looks like. I thought probably a little bit tired from lunch, and I've got 10 minutes, so I'm going to play a 2.5-minute video. And I thought that might just, a few things. I'm not a researcher. Who am I? I'm I'm a mum, auntie, daughter. I'm the dishwasher at the marae. I'm the kaikaranga at the marae when I need to be. And I'm the one that Tarati texts and says, can you make some cakes when there's a hui? And then I do that too. But I suppose, I'm a child of the papakainga. And what I bring here today is some whakaaro about who we are and what we're doing in this space around housing. Oh, come on. pai, o ko tātou tērā, o ko mātou tērā, that's who we are, Ngāti Whātua Rākei, and that's where I've grown up my whole life. I thought before I move on, I thought I could cover all the historical stuff in there to give some context about who we are before I introduced myself to someone and they didn't know where Ōrākei was, so I thought, oh, this, okay. Hui, I thought this is a really important slide. We are a settled iwi. We settled in 2012 and we got our apology from the Crown. So from that date forward, we are now responsible for taking our future into our own hands and making sure that we can produce, we've got responsibilities and we need to make sure that we fulfill those responsibilities, because these people that you see in this photo here, I'm sure that they never ever wanted their people to be homeless and landless. And now when I go through these slides, you'll be able to see some things that we've been able to achieve, and I think it's all due to the vision of our tupuna that left behind this legacy for us to grow. That's our people in 2012 on the steps of Parliament when we brought 3 buses down to sign our agreement with the Crown. Ngāti Whātua Rākei, we know quite a bit about our membership. So we have 4,701 people, Whānau, and the majority of them live in Tāmaki Makaurau. So that's right in Aotearoa, and we know a lot about our people. How many education grants they have, how many children you have, who's your mum and dad. You know, we're pretty good like that, where we can isolate the data so we can make sure that we're providing outcomes that matter to our whānau. With that number, you'll see in that smaller one, 730 of them live in Ōrākei. So I've got 730 neighbours that know me, which is, some people think that's awesome, and then the other part of me thinks, oh, heck. Little bit of context of where we are. That's the Auckland CBD. That little red dot there is Ōrākei. So Ngāti Whātua Rākei, we've now in control of 167 hectares within an 8.5 kilometre radius of the Auckland CBD. Back in 1840, our tupuna Api Haitakawa stood at the summit of Maunga Keke and put his hands out and welcomed the Crown to come and settle in Tāmaki, which was 3,000 acres. So we're just slowly etching our way back to getting a seventh of what we originally gifted the Crown at that time. Because we're here around housing, kaupapa, I thought this is a pretty good slide to show a bit about our journey when it comes to housing. That photo there is of Kāinga Tuatahi, which is a housing development that we started in 2013 and finished in 2016. But I think our housing journey started a long time before 1951, but in terms of getting a physical house on our papakainga, these are what our numbers look like. So we have 33 homes on Boot Hill, which came into tribal ownership in 1978, 68 rentals that we purchased back from Housing New Zealand in 1996, and we're now a community housing provider, so we have control of those houses and we only rent them to whānau. We have 17 licensed occupiers in Ngauho, which is where I grew up with my parents, 8 kaumātua units, another 11 licensed occupiers, which is where we provide the land at no cost and whānau build their houses on top, and they take, so usually back then it was a Housing New Zealand loan that our whānau would take up. Then if you move forward now to 2016, we've got 30 homes, which is Kāinga Tuatahi. What was on that land, this is our sort of first medium density housing project. There was 10 homes on there and about 20 people. Now we've got 30 homes and 145 people living on that site. We got heaps of kids up there and more kids than adults that live on that papakainga. So in total, that's 168 kainga that we have on our papakainga that our tribe has either facilitated us to purchase or build. So in terms of our hapu and involvement in our housing story, it's really important, and our people take it really seriously to look at innovative solutions around housing. I was listening earlier to some of the kōrero about being homeless and landless, and I thought, just skipping to this next slide. Not the greatest map, but that little red square up there is what we were left with in 1951, which is our urupa. Now, in 2019, we have control of all of that coloured boxes that you see there. And, I think about being homeless and landless, that's not what our tupuna envisaged for us. And we've been able to fulfil their legacy by making sure that acre by acre, we're taking back, buying back, however you want to see it, we're making sure that we are getting our lands back so that we've got something that we can leave for our future generations. That oval circle on the right there shows a papakainga plan, a master plan that we're doing on our whenua. And what that is we now know that right now we've got 4,700 whānau, or uri, and we have to plan our whenua in the instance that all 4,700 of them want to move home. So we've looked at our land holdings to make sure that we can facilitate as many houses as we can in our papakainga should they all want to come back. So that's sort of like a long-term vision for us around the utilisations of our lands, given that one block of just land, no chattel, is $1 million in our papakainga. And so that's a bit of context about who we are and some of the challenges that we face, given that the land value is so expensive in Tamaki Makaurau. I think Rose probably got more onto its stats, but it's highly unlikely that a Māori will be able to buy a house in 20 years, like a 20-year-old will be able to do that. And I think that's not at all what our tupuna envisaged. And so from an iwi perspective, we need to make sure that we're putting things in place that are going to allow our tamariki to realise housing aspirations on their papakainga. That's a little bit of historical context, so I'm going to invite Rau to come up and we're going to talk about our project. Maunga kia. Our kaupapa is papakainga teitei, or vertical papakainga. So really interesting, we've been on this journey for about 12 months looking at what this could look like. So as I've explained, lands of high value in our papakainga, so we need to look at the best utilisation of that land so that we can ensure that our whānau have ways to come home. Maunga kia, that's our maunga. My tupuna tupiriri was on that maunga in the mid-1700s. Some of the historical documents say there was over 5,000 people living on that maunga back then. So, it's not new to us. It's about re-engaging with our historical kōrero so that we can facilitate safe spaces for us to really think and engage with how our tupuna once lived, if we're talking about papakainga and vertical papakainga, so apartment type living. Same like at Te Pane o Mataoho or Mangere Mountain. You want to talk to that?
Kia ora tātou. Just as Anahira has said, the original Orake block was always seen as inalienable to Ngāti Whātua Orake, and Api Haitikaua always stated that. And so whatever happens within the original 700-acre block is incredibly important that it's done as well as possible, and it caters for as many Ngāti Whātua people as possible. So the notion of vertical papakainga is logical when you look at those particular issues and the land costs in Orake. And for those of you who don't know, it's probably one of the 2 or 3 most desirable places to live in all of Auckland, and hence Aotearoa. So the brief that we were given by the iwi was to look at some HNZC sites that the iwi has an option on, and so there were three blocks that we were given, and you can see that in the here. This is the area, and it's an area where quite near where Kupe Street meets Kepa Road, so it's just across just over here. So just in terms of these case studies, there weren't many Indigenous case studies that we could look to around the world where kaupapa Māori design principles, Indigenous design principles had informed vertical living environments for Indigenous people. So, but there were some quality, medium density examples that we could look to, particularly the use of roof gardens. And if we think about the Te Pane o Mataoho and the Maunga Keke examples, as Anahere has said, we've lived vertically and densely in the past. It's just a challenge to look at how we can actually combine those two dimensions into effectively an apartment style development. So that's the journey we went on.
Pai, we held a few focus groups. This kaupapa is around a concept so that we can start taking these concepts out to our whānau. So whilst we've allocated or we've worked on a specific site on our whenua where we can do this project, it was about actually let's get into the kaupapa or what it is that we're trying to achieve, because this actually might go somewhere else on our whenua, might go down the road, might go on Kitimuana Street, we just don't know. So I thought it was just, housing's so important to us, it was good to get this mahi underway so that when it does come time for us to really look at vertical papakainga, we're ready to go out the blocks. So these are just some of the pictures of our focus groups that we held.
I'll just back up for a sec to this plan here. So this is our block again, and I'll go forward again. And so effectively what we looked at was a development whereby we could look at a courtyard style approach which had a strong focus on Kupe Street, so acknowledging the life and vitality that Ngāti Whātua Rangataki in particular bring to Kupe Street, which they are progressively reoccupying. And also the idea of having an underground, a smaller parking area underground and a place where you could incorporate communal vehicles, recharging stations and so on. Moving forward up the levels, what you'll begin to see as we go up the levels are the roof gardens, which are in green. So on the first level we see a small roof garden, and then as we go up the levels we get progressively more and more green garden space. That enables any resident to start on the highest level of the development and then walk via the roof gardens all the way down to the that shared courtyard in the middle there. I'll just keep flicking through so we can see. So what we see here is a diagrammatic perspective of the vertical papakainga, with each colour pertaining to a different type or size of unit. So you can see the one-bedroom units are in the light pink, and so on and so forth. Downstairs, critically, is the communal courtyard space there. There's a communal dining room there. There's a communal laundry in here. There's a caretaker or kaitiaki person here. That's probably a whānau who needs to be the eyes and ears of the development, but also the fix-it person. My solar panel's not working or whatever. Someone stole my kumaras from my roof. And there's also a lap pool and a gym up there as well. So it's a concept for how you might begin to incorporate Māori values in a vertical kāinga situation.
No. One of the funny stories when we were doing the kaumātua focus groups is, I thought they'd be really against it. Like, hell no, I'm not living in that. And I said, so what do you think, whānau? And they said, build it tomorrow, bub, we'll move in. And I just thought, oh, that's a good indicator that we're on the right track around the kōrero. So it's not necessarily the physical structure itself, but it's the process in which we go through in the kōrero. Because I found as we kept talking, Ro and I were talking about the process we went through, you could see their eyes light up thinking, you know, they've had themselves 50 years of not having access to kōrero like this. And then when you present it to them in a form that they understand, you know, you see their eyes light up about the possibilities. And, you know, I think that's a good indication that we're on the right track. Similarly, we interviewed some of a group of our tertiary interns, and even their eyes lit up seeing that there's an opportunity for them in a kaupapa like this, vertical papakainga, for them to get onto the housing market. And that too is exciting, and I think that's the exciting part about some of this, the rangahau and the innovation that we're able to do. We already have high-level commitments to sustainability and making sure that living costs is a big issue in Tāmaki, making sure that we're doing whatever we can in that space around housing to bring those costs down and make sure that our whānau are living in quality, healthy, safe, warm, dry homes.
Just a couple of other perspectives on this development. We're aware that even within Ōrākei, people have come from standalone dwellings, and with the kāinga development that Anahira now lives in, it's the first time that the whānau have begun to live slightly more densely, and there's been a lot of learnings come from that. So I think the approach here is to preserve opportunities for privacy. All of these units are self-contained. You don't have to use the laundromat down the bottom, but it's got better machines, and you get a whānau rate, etc. And hopefully the marae will use that laundromat as well. There's a business hub and homework centre in the corner over here. So when the kids get home from school, there's a place for them to go, and they won't just be with their own people their own age, but there'll be adults there who are conducting their own business activities. I guess the next step, apart from ongoing conversations with Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, is to look at the business case and look at how you might look at a mix of tenancies whereby you can have some income-related rent subsidy houses here, you could have some rent-to-own, you could have some equity, shared equity models, and you could have some long-term rentals as well. So the idea is that if a whānau comes into one of these units, that they may migrate around the development as their circumstances change, and they may end up going up to a higher level where there is maybe less noise and more people their own age, and then later on going back down closer to where the mukapuna are living and so on. So that's the kind of where we've landed in terms of a concept. And the next step is to really look at drilling into the tenancy options and procurement options along with the business case. In Auckland at the moment, the housing market is kind of stalled. We've got the large mainstream developers like Ockham. They're building not so much apartment buildings now for sale, but they're building for long-term rentals. So the developers are having to alter their approach to the market that we find ourselves in. But I think Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei are in a great position where they've got a number of different sites where this concept could be further explored and customized different sites.
This is our last slide. I just thought this is a great way to end with some smiling faces. Happens to be that two of those are my daughter and the other one's my niece. But I thought this is just a good way. This is our future. And if we want to make sure that our future is bright, we need to be thinking intergenerationally about the decisions that we make today. So this kaupapa, this research project is really important to us to make sure that we can facilitate housing options, but papakainga housing options for our tamariki and their tamariki. So nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa.
Kei te hāpai o ki muri, kei ngā amorangi ki mua a tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Helen Potter tōku ingoa, no Ngāti Maniapoto me Ngāpui. Firstly, thank you to the organisers for the opportunity to give an overview of the research project undertaken with Mangatawa Papamoa Blocks Incorporated and their Papakainga development on their whenua in Papamoa, where, linking to Moana's kōrero this morning, whānau are both housed and homed. So for this kōrero, I want to talk a bit about the experiences of the whānau living in the Papakainga at Mangatawa and what helps to make it work, and also a bit about the build process and the different financing arrangements used. I don't have a photo that shows the Papakainga in its entirety, so I just wanted to spend a few moments giving an overview of it. So this is a photo of the part of the Papakainga. This is the kaumātua housing, the 2-bedroom kaumātua houses. It's located, the Papakainga's located at the base of their ancestral maunga, Mangatawa, looking out to the sea towards Mauao. It's made up of 31 houses, including 16 homes for kaumātua, the slide, 12 whānau homes and 3 whānau-owned homes, and housing over 70 people, where the streets are not named Cook or Queen, but are named after their ancestors and their history and stories. It's equipped with a sports field, a playground, a barbecue rotunda, and a bus stop connecting the Papakainga with the local bus service, including school buses. There are no fences, and the homes are instead connected by pathways which also connect the Papakainga with Mangatawa Marae, which is close by. The marae is the hub of the Papakainga. It's the centre for the learning of te reo, whai kōrero, karanga, tikanga, and kawa. It hosts a weekly kaumātua program. There's a health clinic there, and the whānau of the Papakainga have established an ECE group that runs there 3 days a week. The Papakainga has been established with the explicit purpose of reconnecting whānau back together, back to their whenua and back to their marae. So what's it like to actually live there? Many of the whānau living in the Papakainga had previously lived in caravans, in the garages or overcrowded homes of whānau, or in houses that were unsafe, cold, damp and mouldy. Many were not necessarily homeless in that they were living on whānau land, but they were not in houses or in houses that were safe and roomy and warm and dry. All of those interviewed talked about the direct impacts that living in the Papakainga has had on their health and well-being. In terms of the kaumātua residents, some talked of having better health from living in a warm home, and others talked about how living in the Papakainga had been excellent for their health and well-being because they had relationships and activities to immerse themselves in instead of illness. Whānau residents talked about how they were often at the doctor's or in hospital with their children before moving into the Papakainga, and how this had also impacted on their own health and well-being. They then talked of how living in the warm, dry Papakainga homes had been transformational to their children's health, with very few doctor's visits and no hospitalisations since, and which had also resulted in improvements in their own health and well-being, including in their relationships with one another. Whānau also talked of the importance of whanaungatanga, of the opportunity to live in a place surrounded by whānau and on the ancestral land and near the marae they are connected to learn more of their whakapapa and stories and how they are connected to each other. What has been especially important for them is the opportunity for their children to grow up in a whānau and marae environment, to play with and build lifelong bonds with their cousins and with the marae, and knowing what to do and how to help. For their tamariki to have the kind of upbringing that they had had, or that their parents or grandparents had had. Importantly, that whakawhanaungatanga also extends out to include the partners of those who connect to Mangatawa. Partners talked about feeling welcomed and at home in the Papakainga, that it was a place to get to know one another and to build relationships, where there is a mindfulness to relationships, a taking care of relationships. Whānau also talked of the manaakitanga they extend to one another, looking after and feeding each other's children, helping each other out, supporting each other through difficult times and sharing what they have. And they've set up a Facebook page to facilitate that support. Another key feature of the papakainga is the learning that takes place there, the intergenerational transfer of knowledge from kaumātua to Pākeke to tamariki, and the opportunities to lead and shape new innovations. There are regular whai kōrero, te reo and karanga classes held at the marae. Many talked of the learning about tikanga and kaua that they receive at the marae, and importantly that their children receive as well, and which they then put into practice in their own homes. The whānau too have expanded their own learning opportunities and experiences, including for their tamariki, such as starting the ECE group at the marae that I've already mentioned, and fundraising for trips away and for trainings for things like rongoa for mamas. There's also been flow-on effects, so the secure tenancies, the healthy homes, the healthy whānau, coupled with whānau support and a deep sense of connectedness to place, has had a number of flow-on effects for their overall well-being. For some, it had meant that school attendance of their children had improved, assisted by having the school bus right there. For others, it had freed them up to think more about the future, to be able to look ahead and plan for the future instead of just living day by day. So in terms of what helps make it work, there have been challenges along the way too. Some whānau talked of the growing pains as whānau residents develop an understanding of being accountable to others living in the papakainga, that it takes time for people to change their ways and learn to live in a whānau environment. So what's helped make it all work? A number of innovations have been developed, and one of the pivotal things for the smooth running of the papakainga has been the development of a specific tenancy manager position, a role which is twofold: to ensure the rental houses are well maintained and the rent is paid, and also to ensure those who live in the papakainga are well supported. There's an open door policy to ensure good communication and enable any issues to be addressed, which have actually been minimal, as whānau are very house proud, they support each other and also hold each other to account. There's also a senior resident in one of the whānau homes who holds the role of kaitiaki to support the whānau and also help maintain the smooth running of the papakainga. Another key innovation has been the establishment of monthly kaumātua meetings and monthly whānau residents meetings to whakawhitiwhiti kōrero, and which are also attended by the tenancy manager and the CEO of the Mangatawa Papamoa Blocks Incorporated. These hui provide an important formal way for the whānau and the papakainga to table their issues of interest or concern and to have a role in leading and shaping its developments. And parents with tamariki also have their own meetings from time to time. Another key thing that has helped make it work is whānau giving valuable support to each other, along with staff and particularly the tenancy manager. Services to address social needs are also offered, and whānau can be referred to external agencies for parenting support, counselling, budgeting advice, drug and alcohol services if needed. So planning for the papakainga began back in the 1980s, and a first build of 4 single-bedroom kaumātua units was completed in 1989. Fast forward 20 years and development of the papakainga was again considered in 2007, and an early step in the process was to survey all the land shareholders to learn what they wanted from a papakainga, and the results showed that they wanted 2-bedroom kaumātua homes and 4-bedroom whānau homes. These kōrero with shareholders in the survey were important elements in developing a really strong unified vision and commitment to each of the new builds completed to date, and there's been 4 builds. Each of those 4 builds was completed using the same stepwise process, the developing of the unified vision, pulling together a technical team to plan what was needed in terms of houses and infrastructure and costing it all up, The teams for each build included a range of expertise, property development management, legal, planning, engineering, and with Victoria Kingi, as many of you know, as the project manager to represent Mangatawa and steer each build stage in line with their vision and aspirations. The third step is about accessing and negotiating funding and finance arrangements to meet the project construction costs, and each of their 4 builds has been structured and financed differently, mainly in response to changing government policies and budget priorities. And finally, the final step, the construction and opening of new homes, including celebrating the openings. So the first build project was to build 10 two-bedroom kaumātua homes, and they were completed and opened in 2011. And a key innovation for the build was how it was funded, and this was via a partnership agreement between Mangatawa and Housing New Zealand, where Housing New Zealand contributed 50% of the capital costs, and Mangatawa borrowed their 50% from Housing New Zealand via a 10-year interest-free loan, while also putting up the land. Under this arrangement, Housing New Zealand leases the houses off Mangatawa for the social housing, paying them a leasehold rent, with kaumātua shareholders as the priority tenants. So that leaseback arrangement made the build financially viable by creating a rental income for Mangatawa to repay the interest-free loan. So they haven't had to sell any land or borrow any additional money. So they've been able to capitalise on the strength of their land ownership and having a strong administrative infrastructure, while the government has been able to increase its social housing supply. And it really shows you what you can do when you have land, and shows the importance of understanding the needs of government and their need to perform and provide outcomes, and how lining these two things up can create win-win arrangements. Obviously, the involvement of Housing New Zealand has brought challenges too. There are, changing staff, the change in governments, so a focus on maintaining the relationships and having good communications has been critical to managing those challenges. Another innovation in the kaumātua homes was the involvement of kaumātua themselves in designing the layout of the homes. As a result, the new design features were added, including having the laundry separate and away from the kitchen, and having a lot more additional space and storage. And the excellence of the resulting designs for these houses won a Waikato Bay of Plenty Architecture Award in 2012. And then a second stage, a second build stage was for an additional two kaumātua homes, which were completed and opened in 2013. And the opportunity to build these additional homes arose out of excess funding within the social housing unit's annual budget, and they put up 100% of the capital, and Mangatawa putting up the land. And the successful design of the first build was carried through into the second build. So that was really a matter of being in the sort of right place at the right time and having a model that could be rolled out quickly. The third build stage was for 12 four-bedroom whānau homes, so delivering on that survey that had been conducted. And this build was completed and opened in 2015. Funding again came through the social housing unit, who this time put up 75% of the capital, with Mangatawa putting in the land and the remaining 25%. And to prepare for this stage and to make the homes affordable for whānau to rent, Mangatawa applied for and obtained community housing provider status. It enables them to access a government income-related rent subsidy for its whānau tenants, and it can offer that reduced rent to whānau where they pay no more than 30% of their household income, and the difference between the reduced rent and the market rent is topped up by the government. So again, the loan is being paid back by government money. So a new relationship was developed with MSD to tenant the homes as a change in government policy had transferred that top-up subsidy role to them from Housing New Zealand. As with the relationship with Housing New Zealand, complexities have also arisen because of staff and government changes, which means arrangements and relationships have to be constantly renegotiated. The policies also change, such as the social housing criteria, which means finding tenants who meet those criteria. And as we've heard a lot about today, there's been no problem finding tenants to meet those criteria. And the tenancies have to go through MSD processes, but there have been innovations such as having the MSD staff come out to the papa kāinga and process all the applications rather than people going into town and going through their offices. So the fourth build stage, the most recent one, has been for 3 whānau-owned homes, which were completed and occupied by whānau in 2017. So this has been another big priority, is for whānau to own their own homes. The original plan was to build 8 homes for whānau ownership, and 20 different whānau put in applications. Workshops were held to go over the processes involved so that they could assess whether it was a right fit for them, as they'd need to get mortgage approval for a kāinga whenua loan. The process of accessing those loans was, however, really difficult, and only 3 of those 20 whānau were able to get approval. And as a consequence, the build was just 3 houses and not the intended 8. And that process shows how difficult it is to get into your own home, even when you have a big corporation and an experienced team behind you, and even with the land being provided at no cost. And even though all the applicants were 2-income families, the kāinga whenua loans were difficult, if not impossible, to obtain. And that's because, in a nutshell, the policies just do not recognise and provide for the fact of low incomes. And so a much more tailored loan scheme is needed, in a real area, I think, for further development. The other complication arose with the concrete pad design of the homes. Housing New Zealand policy requirement is that kāinga whenua funded homes be built on piles rather than concrete pads, because they operate on the assumption that they will need to be relocated if the loan is not repaid. So a real environment of low trust. It took 12 months of negotiations with Housing New Zealand to resolve, lots of legal costs involved, and the need for Mangatawa to provide a guarantee for the kāinga whenua loans secured by bank bond. But obviously that has now meant that there is a process to enable whānau to use kāinga whenua loans to build on concrete pads. So infrastructure costs for each home were funded through an infrastructure grant from Te Puni Kōkiri, with the build aspect funded by individual mortgages and savings via kāinga whenua loan and Kiwi Saver schemes, and Home Start grants from Housing New Zealand. And as with the previous builds, the land provided by Mangatawa. The homes are owned by whānau via a licence to occupy agreement between the owner and Mangatawa, who retain that ownership of the land. So all of these 4 builds have been done without selling any of their land, and that's been a really important kaupapa of theirs to uphold. But the whānau owned homes, the build for that was a really complicated process, and one that Mangatawa will be looking to reset for the build of the remaining 5 whānau owned homes. And there is I've got a fact sheet summarising the financial and funding arrangements for those 4 builds if people are interested in having it. So yeah, it was that's the story of Mangatawa at the moment, and more to come as they look to build more whānau-owned homes, more kaumātua homes, and smaller homes for smaller whānau. Kia ora rā.
Oh, and I'm one of those fortunate people who've been to Mangatawa and the beautiful development up there. Tēnei te mihi atu kia koutou. Now, we have some questions that have been submitted via your flash little app. And Tamati, I think the first one is for you. Are you satisfied with the consultation and engagement, if there was any, that Tāmaki Regeneration undertook with the community prior to development?
No.
No. Okay. Talk to us about that.
Kia ora. Thank you for the pātai. No, because it's a top-down situation. It's a top-down situation made under duress, a lot of financial pressure, economic treasury-based pressure, council pressures, developing super city pressures. It all developed from there. So a lot of pressures to make TRC an exemplar for the nation. And in a lot of ways, the majority of our population in the community have been collateral damage to the learning. And that's the mamai that I speak about quite candidly. We are collateral damage. And the situation is not a new one. We've known this for centuries, actually, that state-supported people and communities tend to be treated like passive objects and are not well engaged with. We're dealt to and dealt for, but not with. Collaboration is the future. Co-creation is the way forward. Have got to influence positive engagements where we listen to each other, we respect the solutions that are driven from expertise from the hood. We have expertise. We are specialists. We have our own solutions to contribute to the kaupapa. So no, not at this point in time.
And what did that, can you see part 2 of that pātai? Or?
Is that the one about being in this mixed housing tenure? I don't know. Do you know?
What did community engage? Oh, no. I want to ask, the question was for you, Tamati, what's the difference between kāinga and tūranga waiwai? Oh, I didn't practice using this flash technology. The question is for you, Tamati, but can I ask that of everybody? Oh, okay, I've got a screen here, just seen it.
Can I position something a little bit more provocative? That in co-creation and in collaboration, we have got to allow for difference of identity, belonging, and perspective. Some of us may not suit a kāinga development. Some of us may suit a kibbutz. Some of us may suit different scenarios. So in saying that, collaboration and co-creation for the future has got to be a dialogue.
Kia ora. So I was born in a place called Ahipara, which we called a kāinga. Whereas I have 3 places that are my tūranga waiwai because I have 3 iwi that I have to say at this point though, in 1,000 years, not one of my ancestors went south of Mangamuka for a missus. Quite frankly, it's a miracle I haven't got 3 eyes. Engari, when I'm in Ngāti Kuri, Ngātaki is my tūranga waiwai. When I'm in Te Rāroa, Ahipara is my tūranga waiwai. When I'm in Ngāti Kahuki Whangaro, Waimahana is my tūranga waiwai. But I was born in a kāinga. That's the only way I can explain the difference for me.
Oh no, kua marama. I would have loved to have been on Ask Your Auntie with Ella. It would have been an absolute scream. Any other thoughts on that one? Difference between kāinga and tūranga waiwai?
I think we're looking back to Moana Jackson's commentary at the end of his keynote today. I think he was positing, kind of a future outlook on kāinga, which was it's built on the traditional values of the rural original homelands, but had critical qualities of kāinga, and I think that's something for us to continue to investigate. What are those critical qualities of kāinga? One thing I do know is security of tenure is a critical dimension to kāinga, that someone else is not going to be evicting you or moving you on in some way. I think it's probably critical dimension there. Another dimension, I think, is that you are connected to the organisation that owns the whenua or manages the whenua. So you've got some sort of kaupapa connection there as well. So that's just two dimensions that I've thought of, but I'm sure there's a lot of other dimensions. Kia ora.
Oh, kia ora. It throws up a lot more questions for me in terms of what does it mean to be tauira here? What about land where, the Māori Land Court was about drawing grids and lines on Papatuanuku, and we've been, some whānau were assigned some lands and other people were assigned out. Whānau who removed surveyor pegs were cut out completely right from the get-go. So what's tūranga waiwai, who's whenua, succession to that whenua. There's lots of questions. Kia ora.
So there were more questions than answers up here. Hey, I'm not trying to put words into Moana's mouth. Kāinga, house, tūranga waiwai, home. That's my thoughts. I wasn't asked the question, but I thought, I can't get past this whole notion of co-create, not to be confused with procreate, which is acceptable too, because then that builds the tribe. Given everything that we have heard so far today, what needs to happen now?
How long you got?
Okay, 6 minutes. You can have 5 of those. No, we've got a bit of time.
I think we're at a point in this government where they've got their feet under the table and there is a reset occurring on the Kiwi Build approach. There is a lot of work happening with the new Housing and Urban Development Authority, which is about to be born. So I think we're going to see a lot of activity, and we are seeing a lot of activity right now. The question really to the ministries and the government is how much of that activity is targeted and tailored to our Māori people, and that's the big question at the moment. Is there's stuff going on, and it will inevitably cater for some Māori who qualify or meet the criteria for all those different types of housing developments, state housing and HLC housing and so on. Right? So that's the question that's really live, is at what point are we going to see those tailored Māori housing solutions, marae-based housing policy and products, rangatahi home ownership products, intergenerational whānau loan products. When can we start to see that work take place?
Kia ora tātou. From a Ngāti Whātua Rākei perspective, I think we own a lot of land. Our goal is to maximise the utilisation of that land so our whānau can move back. The issue that we have is the amount of capital that's required to invest into new housing, which is all sort of a product of our settlement. So we're using all of our settlement funds to invest into something that the Crown should be at least assisting or helping us to achieve. I think of kāinga, there was $18 million off our balance sheet that we couldn't put in to reinvest to get a yield back. So, I think if we can have conversations at that top level about how we can facilitate conversations with banking institutions would be one thing I'd really encourage. And the other thing would be for the government to consider how they can facilitate, especially with medium density and high density housing opportunities on Papa Kāinga land or multiply owned land.
Kia ora. I believe in Māori, the Māori worldview. Like, believe it. And I've been asked if Māori is a religion because of the way that I speak about Māoritanga. I believe that as ngā kete o te wānanga are lived and held with honour, with respect, with spirit, with generosity, with forgiveness, and all of those qualities that make us loving human beings. Ngā kete o te wānanga is the way forward, at all levels. If we continue the conversation that has been had for decades now, we'll get the same result. We've got to change the conversation, and it's the quality of the conversation that we're having. Kia ora.
Kia ora. So I guess moving forward, and I'm saying this in aroha mai moana, he urban Māori and I, unashamedly, living gratefully in some other rohe, like 80% of the rest of the Māori world. You know, the great bulk of us live outside of our tribal rohe. And the last thing in the world that muri whenua needs is for 10,000 of us to go home, because there's not enough toilets, for one thing. So you fellas in the urban areas are stuck with us. And the reality is whilst we need government and Crown agencies to tailor strategies and programs for our housing aspirations, and I think that's absolutely critical, I also think there is a dialogue that needs to occur between mātāwaka and mana whenua, which is part of the moving forward, because, I'm not going back to ahipara. I'm sorry, bub, you're stuck with me forever. Maybe I'll go home in a box. But so we've got to figure out, and my mokos are not going back to ahipara. So we've got to figure out how to live with each other as Māori. And I think that's part of, as you said, one of the decolonial processes, how we have that discussion with ourselves and how we be Māori in the multiplicity of ways that being Māori means in the 21st century as part of the decolonisation agenda.
Which I think you might be starting on this next question that Pani has put up. What does urbanisation mean? Especially for those of us who especially for us who are considered urbanised, when urbanisation in fact came to us. And the example she's given is ōrākei, cleanliness, ihu matao.
I mean, you fellas are mana whenua in that area, so I'm just going to talk about the research and what we found, that as the bulk of Māori living in Glen Innes were not of that place. In fact, they were the part of that urban migration of the 1950s that came to the city for work and stayed and bred generations. So there's a sense of that is their kāinga in many ways, not kāinga tūturu, which is a distinction I make. I mean, we have a village that we create wherever we go, but the kāinga tūturu is the tūranga waiwai. And so the question, what does urbanisation mean? Oh, do you know what I think urbanisation means? I think urbanisation means how we define it on the day.
Okay.
There's a kōrero that there's a well-kept quote from Api Haetekawau, and he is speaking at William Hobson's tangi, and he says, "E hara koe I te tama, he whatu toto koe." You are not just a man, a person. We are weaved in blood. This is Api Haetekawau's kōrero to William Hobson. So that's a pivotal and poignant and important view to really understand. For those of us who've been traumatised through urbanisation, we've got to understand that Api Haetekawau, our tupuna, said there's a weave there, and there's an establishment there, and there's a respect there, and there's a mandate. What happened after that, we know what happened, but that's a really important thing for us to understand. The beginning of that urban relationship is something that I thought I might position.
I don't consider myself urban. I do like that second part, is that urbanisation came to us and it happened around us. I was brought up on my papa kāinga. I can speak my language, and so too can my children. So, I think that's our way of life. You know, the city grew up around us, and now there's 1.4 million people there, and I've got 730 neighbours that are my relations. So, you know, it's just, I suppose it's a different way of looking at things, given the location that we are in. But yeah, it came to us, but you know, it's about how we can revive our tikanga, kawa, our kōrero amongst our whānau now, given that we all live within like 100 metres of the marae. So, you know, I think having that our marae there is our central institution, for lack of better words, but, you know, that helps to ground us in terms of who we are.
So I want to say this again too, and with respect to our tupuna. The Māori is an issue. The Māori ora is an issue in these heavy, dense cities. That's a real issue. Out in that water over there, Waitemata, Kaipara, the Māori ora is severely impacted. It's almost Māori mate, you know. When you go to rural places out on the coast, there's Māori ora. So that's a significant thing that needs to be talked about as well.
Kia ora. Yes, sometimes the word, you know, urbanisation's used as a bit of an insult to say you're urbanised, you don't count anymore, you don't know your identity, you're disconnected, and to really diminish our authority to make decisions for our people, for our whenua. And so going back to the earlier question, about where do the answers lie, and I think from John Reed's kōrero this morning and the idea that that there are many strategies, many paths to follow, building up rental housing, ownership, papakainga, marae as a space for housing, they all need to be done, but who's making the decision? These are all builds are done on whenua, and what are the relationships with mana whenua around those decisions, and who gets included and who doesn't, not just in the decisions, but in, like Ro said, in terms of the housing that gets developed. Because, you know, so many areas are being developed, there's only certain number of homes for low-income whānau in those developments. So if you're not wealthy, where do you live? Where will you live in the future? Where are the places?
Just a brief comment on Māori urbanisation. I think, as we heard, Māori have been ushered into the cities through a number of different pieces of legislation. And no one at that point in time asked mana whenua or the range of mana whenua groups, oh, is it okay if we get, 3,000 people from up north into Te Atatū Peninsula, etc., etc. But I think now that there's a greater awareness of a mana whenua status versus manuhiri status, I think those of us who are manuhiri just need to learn how to be good manuhiri. And remember, when you are back at your kāinga tūturu, how you'd like others to be acting around you and towards you. And I think at a practical level, being a good manuhiri is about looking after the whenua, or being a contributor to the kaitiaki processes for the water that Tamati's mentioned, for the soil and the air quality.
Tamati, there's a question up here. Can you provide a practical example of ngā kete wānanga? And Ella, if I can just get you to go over the research question there about those wānau who were evicted. We'll start with you, Tamati.
One thing that I really am proud about as a Māori is that we have the ability and the capacity and a skill that is driven from when we're born to be present to death, mate. Tangi is an important institution. And when we go to tangi, when we are conversant with tangi, when we develop that skill, because it's a developed skill, we develop the ability to be with wairua, with tangi, grief, with mourning, and of those facets of tūpunatanga. So for the home fires, we provide that space. We karanga people in literally. We allow them to be whoever they need to be, whether they're grieving, whether they're in joy, whatever their spiritual state is. We acknowledge that from the outset. And secondly, it's all about relationships. It's always going to be about tying and whanaungatanga, weaving the kōrero together. So storytelling, coming from an authentic creativity in terms of who we are, where we're from, that's part of the relational. So tuauri is the kete o te wairua, āhua, in a nutshell. Tuatea is the kete of a relational space, of whakapapa. And lastly, aronui is about what we do with what we know, how we get on with it, how we infuse all of that wairua, whakapapa knowledge into action. And so Home Fires is all about action. It's not just sitting around saying kumbaya. It's about whānau, residents, whole of community businesses, developers, as many people as we can get into that project, developing a future together. So that's ngā kete o te wānanga.
Kia ora. So the question has, any research track the outcomes for those who were displaced? It's an interesting position because what we were able to find from the data that we collected, and admittedly from TRC, as well as the discussions we'd had with particularly those representatives in local council, is that prior to TRC there was another entity going back 10 years. Yeah, TCP. And that organisation had a very, from what I understand, comprehensive consultation with people. Everybody that was moved eventually had choices of either coming back or staying, in the new improved housing where they went. The difficulty happened with the transition to TRC. So of the 2,700 houses that have been removed and the 7,500 that are to replace them, they've barely got a quarter of those done, I think, as at early this year. So 3/4 of the families who were moved out of the area still have not been able to be moved. Now, that does not mean they were evicted and put into, caravan parks and motels. They were put into other houses. But the displacement is about loss of community, not loss of house. And I think it goes back to that whole distinction between Kāinga and Tūranga Waiwai. Yes, they got moved to another state house, but they no longer live next door to their cousins and across the road from their auntie. So that's the trauma, the mamai that Tamati's talking about. So they, from what I understand, everybody had a choice to return, but it's taking so long for the rebuild that often now they've gone off and created new communities elsewhere, like last year, the ones that came back, who talked about their mamai. Yes, they've been gone for 5 years, so even if they had a chance to come back in another 3 or 4 years when it's finished, it won't be the same place. So that didn't really answer your question, but there is no actual answer to that particular question. There's only the information we have about those people who've either come back in and they love their new, mixed tenure houses, even though they're the poor people at the end, and the people in the middle paid $850 affordable, and the people up the end paid $1.1 million for a 3-bedder, 2-bathroom, 1 undercover car park NGI. Who would have thunk? And now they're all supposed to play nice. That's the social cohesion challenge.
Ka pai. Now, Jessica, I think I'm coming to you.
Okay. I think I need mic 2 turned on, thank you. So, kia ora no everybody. We just had a question earlier on for Moana that we didn't ask. And so I'll just read out the question and then I'll pass over to Moana. So the question is, to what extent does Dr. Jackson consider that our current cohort of politicians are open to or are actively exploring constitutional change in the way that you discuss? I'm so sorry.
Kia ora and kia ora to our kaikorero first. That was an amazing session. Thank you. He tino mihi kia koutou. I can answer that in 2 ways. The first is the most important answer, that I don't think the solution necessarily lies with politicians. All the great changes in human history have happened because people wanted the change, and then the politicians tended to follow afterwards. And so On the issue of constitutional transformation, I think that's a conversation that has to happen amongst ordinary people. Do we want to have a country that is based upon the relation treaty, or do we want to continue to be governed through an adversarial system that comes from somewhere else, that is not born of the ineffable hopes in this land? The second part of the question is more specific. I think there are some politicians who are committed to doing things differently, to seeking different ways of finding solutions, but they are hamstrung by the current system within which they operate. When you have an adversarial system, as the Westminster system is, then by its very nature, I think, it mitigates against cooperation, it mitigates against consensus, and favours conflict. And I've never been able to understand the cultural presumption that conflict is the best way to reach good decisions. So there are a number of politicians, I think, who would like to see things differently, and part of the challenge is to alter the framework within which they currently operate. Kia ora.
Ka pai. Well, that brings us to a conclusion. I think we might be actually getting a bit of rhythm going with these questions on your app. So we'll keep practicing for the rest of the afternoon. By day 2, we'll be experts, and I would have figured out I don't need to turn around and read the screen behind me to find the questions. O tino, tēnei te mihi atu ki koutou, te kāhui e noho ana ki runga i te ātāmira. And the organisers, we have a nice little something over there for you to say thank you for sharing your thoughts and your dreams with this conference. Tēnā tātou, we are going to break for afternoon tea.